At 2300 hours on November 14th, 1942, the night sea around Guadalcanal was alive with black water and moonless shadows. The American battleship USS Washington moved silently through the darkness, its hull cutting through the Pacific with a steady, ominous rhythm. Above, the tropical night was thick and starless. Only the faint flicker of gunfire on the horizon hinted at the chaos that had gripped these waters for days. In her combat information center, green radar screens pulsed with light. The operators, young men barely out of their teens, watched the blips move, faint echoes of Japanese ships closing fast. It was the first time in naval history that radar would truly decide the fate of a battle. On Washington's bridge stood Rear Admiral Willis A, a quiet Kentuckian with round glasses, calm eyes, and a reputation for precision. To his men, he looked more like a schoolteacher than a warrior. But Lee was a student of war, and tonight he had the tools to redefine it. His ship carried the most advanced radar system in the Pacific, the SG Surface Search Set, capable of tracking enemy vessels in total darkness long before they could see him. Lee's orders were simple: protect Guadalcanal. The island had become the pivot of the Pacific War, a patch of jungle and coral reefs where the fate of empires now rested. The Japanese had been trying for months to retake the airfield the Marines called Henderson. Every few nights, they sent battleships and cruisers down the slot, shelling the island under cover of darkness. The Americans called these night attacks the Tokyo Express. Now, intelligence reports suggested another bombardment was coming, and this time it would be bigger than any before. Admiral Kondo's force included the battleship Kirishima, veteran of Pearl Harbor and one of Japan's most feared surface killers. She was escorted by cruisers and destroyers, all battle-hardened, all expecting another easy victory over the Americans. But tonight would be different. Lee's force, the battleships Washington and South Dakota, escorted by 4 destroyers, steamed west at 26 knots. The destroyers fanned out ahead, their wakes glowing faintly with phosphorescence. Each man aboard knew that somewhere out there, beyond the dark horizon, an enemy fleet was hunting them. Yet no one spoke of fear. They trusted their ships. They trusted their admiral. Lee had studied the failures of earlier battles around Guadalcanal, chaotic, disorganized slugfests fought in near total darkness, where ships fired on friends as often as foes. He had promised himself that if he ever fought a night battle, he would not let that happen. Tonight he would prove that radar, not eyesight, not luck, would rule the seas. At 23:06, a faint contact appeared on Washington's radar, range 18,000 yards, bearing northwest. Then another. Then 4 more. The enemy was coming straight toward them. Lee leaned over the plotting table, watching the pencil lines trace converging courses. His voice, calm and deliberate, broke the silence. Enemy force bearing 270. Stand by for radar range. Through the night, the 2 American battleships steamed side by side, their 16-inch guns trained forward. The destroyers ahead, Walkie, Benham, Preston, and Gwynn, advanced to intercept. Within minutes, their lookouts spotted the faint glow of Japanese searchlights sweeping the sea. Then came the flares, brilliant magnesium arcs that turned the darkness into daylight. The Japanese had seen them. Tracer fire ripped through the night. The destroyers charged headlong into the maelstrom, launching torpedoes at invisible targets. In seconds, Walkie was hit. A massive explosion tore her apart amidships. Preston followed, her deck engulfed in fire. Benham was crippled by a torpedo. Gwynn turned to avoid the wreckage, her guns still blazing. Within 10 minutes, 3 American destroyers were gone. The sea ahead was a burning graveyard. On Washington's bridge, Lee gave a single, measured order: open fire. 8 16-inch guns erupted in a synchronized roar that shook the ocean. Each shell weighed 2,700 pounds, each one capable of tearing through armor like paper. At 8,400 feet per second, they crossed the darkness in less than 10 seconds. The radar operators called out corrections. Target 2, bearing 310, range 18,200. Fire. Shells landed with terrifying precision. Japanese lookouts on Kirishima never saw where the fire was coming from. Their rangefinders were useless, their night optics blinded by gun flashes. Within minutes, Kirishima was struck by at least 9 16-inch shells and over 45-inch hits. One shell smashed through her armor belt, detonating in the engine room. Another ripped open her forward turret, killing the entire gun crew. Flames shot hundreds of feet into the air. The proud battleship that had shelled Pearl Harbor was now burning helplessly, her steering jammed, her decks shattered. But the Japanese fought back fiercely. Their cruisers and destroyers closed in, firing torpedoes in frantic salvos. One passed so close beneath Washington's bow that it lifted the ship from the water. The concussion rattled teeth and smashed instruments, but the battleship kept firing. For 20 minutes, the Pacific became a cauldron of fire and steel. Shells screamed overhead. The night pulsed with explosions. On Washington's decks, sailors worked with mechanical precision, loading, firing, adjusting bearings, their faces lit by the orange glow of gunfire. They could see South Dakota off their port beam, silhouetted by burning destroyers. Then came disaster. South Dakota's electrical systems failed. A power surge knocked out her radar, her communications, and her gun directors. She was suddenly blind. In the chaos, she turned slightly off course, drifting into the light of Japanese search beams. For the next 5 minutes, South Dakota became the sole focus of the Japanese fleet. Shells rained down on her, 14-inch, 8-inch, and 5-inch rounds, striking her superstructure, radar masts, and gun turrets. Her crew fought fires, tended to the wounded, and kept firing back. But she was crippled, unable to communicate or maneuver effectively. From Washington, Lee watched in silence. He could see South Dakota glowing under enemy fire, a burning target surrounded by muzzle flashes. He had seconds to decide. If he turned to help her, he'd reveal his own position. If he held his fire, the Japanese might finish her. But if he stayed hidden, Washington still had the advantage of radar and surprise. Lee made his decision. He ordered Washington to maintain course and open fire independently, a move that defied doctrine but saved the battle. His gunners reacquired Kirishima and resumed their deadly rhythm. Radar bearings came crisp and steady. Target bearing 325, range 8,400, fire for effect. 8 more 16-inch guns thundered in unison. Shells landed with horrifying precision. One slammed through Kirishima's rudder compartment, flooding her steering gear. Another exploded near her aft magazines. The Japanese crew tried to flood the magazines before they ignited. Some didn't make it in time. By 23:32, Kirishima was listing heavily to starboard, burning from bow to stern. Her captain ordered abandon ship. Admiral Kondo, still convinced he was facing multiple American cruisers, ordered his surviving ships to retreat. Kirishima rolled over and sank just after 300, taking more than 300 men with her. When the firing stopped, the sea fell eerily quiet. Washington was alone. Her radar showed no more targets. Her deck was slick with seawater and spent shell casings. Her gunners stood at their stations, exhausted, ears ringing, The silence was almost unbearable. Then came the realization they had survived. Against overwhelming odds, they had fought an entire Japanese task force to a standstill. One battleship using radar and discipline had destroyed another in total darkness, the first and only time in history such a thing had been done. As dawn broke over the Solomon Sea, the full scale of the victory became clear. The Japanese fleet had been driven off. Guadalcanal was safe, and for the first time, Japan's aura of night-fighting invincibility was shattered. On Washington's bridge, Lee stood quietly, looking toward the smoke on the horizon. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. His crew already understood what they had achieved. That morning, Admiral William Halsey sent a brief, understated message. "Well done, Washington. You have written your name into history." It was more than a victory. It was a transformation. The age of radar warfare had begun. The morning of November 15th, 1942, rose slowly over the Solomon Islands. The Pacific was still, deceptively calm, but it carried the scars of what had happened hours before. The water was thick with oil and debris. Lifeboats drifted aimlessly. The faint crackle of fires floated on the humid air, mingling with the low groan of wounded metal as the sea claimed its dead. The battle was over, but for the men of USS Washington, the weight of it was only beginning to settle. They had fought blind under impossible conditions against a numerically superior enemy, and won. It wasn't just a tactical victory. It was a demonstration of what the future of naval warfare would look like. Radar had changed everything. In the calm light of dawn, crewmen moved quietly along Washington's decks, washing away the soot and blood that covered the steel. Shell casings, dented and blackened, rolled with the ship's gentle motion. Some sailors, too exhausted to speak, leaned against the gun turrets, staring into the sea where Hiroshima had gone down. One young gunner, barely 20, whispered under his breath, "She was there, and then she wasn't." No one replied. Everyone felt the same. The enemy had vanished beneath the same waves they floated on. In those hours, Rear Admiral Willis A. Lee walked the deck with his usual quiet composure. He didn't bask in victory. He didn't give speeches. He simply checked on his men. Some saluted. Others just nodded, too drained to say a word. He returned each with the same steady, reassuring look, the kind that said, "You did your duty." To Lee, that was enough. The battle reports would later describe the engagement as one of the most one-sided duels in naval history. Washington had fired 75 16-inch shells and over 100 5-inch rounds in less than half an hour. Her radar-directed gunnery had been so precise that Japanese survivors would later report they never saw the flashes, only the shells. South Dakota, battered but afloat, had taken over 20 major hits and survived. The destroyers, Walkie, Benham, Preston, and Gwynn, had paid dearly for their courage. Out of their combined crews, hundreds were lost in the opening minutes of the fight. Yet their sacrifice had drawn the enemy's fire long enough for Washington to deliver her killing blows. On the Japanese side, the loss of Hiroshima was catastrophic. She was one of the last battleships available to support Guadalcanal. Her sinking crippled the Imperial Navy's ability to conduct night bombardments. More than that, it shattered their confidence. The Japanese had long believed that they owned the night, that their superior optics, discipline, and experience gave them the edge in darkness. But now, that myth had been destroyed by technology they couldn't yet understand. Radar had stripped the night of its secrets. When Admiral Kondo reported the battle's outcome to Tokyo, the reaction was grim silence. Hiroshima's loss was not just a tactical defeat, it was a psychological one. The Japanese had entered the war believing that honor and training could overcome any technical disadvantage. But in a single night, they had discovered that machines, cold, silent, and precise, could see farther than the human eye and kill without ever being seen. Meanwhile, back at Guadalcanal, the Marines on Henderson Field heard the distant thunder of guns offshore. For hours, they waited for the usual bombardment that never came. When dawn arrived and the horizon was empty, they realized something had changed. The shelling had stopped. The Tokyo Express had been broken. On board Washington, as reports were compiled, one of Lee's officers approached him on the bridge and said, "Sir, that was the finest piece of gunnery I've ever seen." Lee didn't look up from his chart. He simply replied, "It was radar that did it, not me." It was a modest statement, but one that spoke volumes. Lee had understood something that few others did at that moment, that the future of naval warfare no longer belonged solely to courage or instinct. It belonged to science, precision, and the invisible reach of technology. Within days, the battle was being studied across the Pacific. Commanders pored over Washington's fire control data, analyzing how radar had tracked, ranged, and destroyed a target in complete darkness. The results changed everything. Training programs were rewritten. Tactics were updated. Ships that had relied on optical rangefinders began installing SG radar systems as standard equipment. Gunners were retrained to fight using instruments rather than eyes. The U.S. Navy, which had entered the war behind in night fighting skills, was now leading the world in radar-directed combat. For the sailors of Washington, the battle earned them a reputation as the ship that could see in the dark. The nickname spread quietly through the fleet, whispered with a mix of awe and respect. Other ships had fought bravely. Washington had fought with precision. Rear Admiral Lee, however, refused any special praise. In his official report, he wrote, "The result was due to training, discipline, and the effectiveness of radar. Nothing else." That humility defined him. He was a man who never sought glory, only results. He would go on to serve through the rest of the war, participating in key operations across the Pacific. His methods, his calm command style, and his faith in technology would influence every American naval engagement that followed, from the Marianas to the Philippine Sea to Leyte Gulf. And yet, for all his achievements, the night action off Guadalcanal would remain his finest hour. It was the moment when everything he believed in, preparation, precision, and quiet control, proved stronger than chaos. When news of the battle reached the United States, it lifted spirits at a time when the Pacific War still hung in doubt. Newspapers called it the battle that saved Guadalcanal. For the first time, Americans realized that the tide could be turned, not just through numbers, but through ingenuity. Because on that night, under a black Pacific sky, the U.S. Navy had outfought its enemy. Years later, historians would look back and call it the birth of the modern naval age. Before Washington, battles were decided by who saw who first. After her, they were decided by who could detect and strike first, and that distinction would define warfare for generations to come. In the years that followed, radar technology advanced rapidly. The lessons learned aboard Washington were applied to every new class of ship. The U.S. Navy developed advanced radar fire control systems, guided munitions, and electronic warfare, all descendants of that single night's success. As for Admiral Lee, he remained a symbol of calm mastery, a commander who trusted reason over emotion and science over superstition. In August 1945, shortly after Japan's surrender, Lee died suddenly of a heart attack aboard his flagship Wyoming. He was 57 years old. When the news reached his former crew, many wept openly. They said he never raised his voice in anger, never sought fame, and never lost a man to carelessness. One officer wrote later, "He made us believe in discipline without fear and in technology without arrogance." In the decades since, the night battle off Guadalcanal has been studied in naval academies around the world. It remains one of the purest demonstrations of what happens when human courage meets innovation and when leadership trusts its tools as much as its instincts. The sea where Kirishima sank is now quiet. Divers sometimes find fragments of her armor, twisted and rusting, scattered across the ocean floor. The Pacific has long since taken her back. But the story of that night, of the ship that fought in the dark and turned chaos into control, still echoes through history. Because on November 14th, 1942, the U.S. Navy didn't just win a battle. It crossed a threshold from the age of steel and eyesight to the age of electrons and precision. And it all began with one man, one ship, and one moment of perfect clarity in the blackness of war. The night radar met gunfire and forever changed the sea. As the decades passed, the memory of that battle began to fade from public consciousness. The great carriers, Enterprise, Yorktown, Lexington, took center stage in every history book and documentary. The Marines of Guadalcanal, the pilots of Midway, the soldiers who stormed Normandy, their stories were rightfully celebrated. But the quiet, disciplined men who stood behind the 16-inch guns of Washington, they became a footnote. Their triumph in the dark, that perfect fusion of technology and human resolve, slipped into obscurity. Yet for those who have studied naval warfare closely, that night remains one of the most significant turning points in modern military history. It was the first time radar truly proved its worth in combat, not as a defensive measure, but as an offensive weapon. It turned a single ship, fighting alone, into an unstoppable force. It's important to understand what made Washington so different. This wasn't just brute firepower, though her guns could throw a 2,700-pound shell 20 miles. It was precision. Every turret, every gun, every radar operator worked as one seamless system. Information flowed through the ship like electricity. The radar tracked, the plotting room calculated, and within seconds, data became destruction. Admiral Lee didn't see his ship as a weapon of war. He saw it as a machine of geometry, a perfectly calibrated equation where time, range, and bearing intersected to form victory. His command bridge was not chaos and shouting. It was quiet efficiency. Orders were given in low voices, and the only sounds were the rhythmic reports of bearings, ranges, and impacts. And that's what made the difference. Because in the confusion of naval battle, smoke, darkness, water, fear, clarity becomes the rarest weapon of all. Washington had that clarity. Her men trusted their instruments. They trusted their admiral. And together they struck faster and truer than any ship had done before. When Admiral Kondo's fleet limped back to Truk Lagoon, their morale shattered. They couldn't comprehend what had happened. How could a single American ship, unseen, unheard, destroy one of Japan's proudest battleships without ever taking a hit? To them, it was as if the Americans had become ghosts in the night. Japanese officers began whispering rumors. Perhaps the Americans had new eyes that could see through darkness, or new magic that could guide their shells. They weren't far off. Radar had indeed given the Americans a kind of mechanical sight, one the Japanese couldn't match. Their own radar programs lagged behind, and what they had was primitive by comparison. It would take months before they could even begin to understand what had defeated them that night. But by then, the momentum of the war had already begun to shift. In the months that followed, the U.S. Navy would build upon Washington's victory. Radar fire control became standard. Crews drilled for night fighting until it became instinct. Ships that once feared the darkness now sought it, knowing they could dominate the unseen. And while Washington herself never again fought a surface battle of that scale, her influence spread across the fleet like a ripple through water. Every radar-equipped battleship, every cruiser that learned to fight in the dark, carried a little piece of that night's legacy. When Washington returned to port, her crew was celebrated, quietly, of course. There were no parades, no grand speeches. The Navy, focused on the carrier war now raging across the Pacific, saw the victory as a tactical success, not a strategic revelation. But the men aboard her knew better. They knew they had witnessed something historic, a moment where courage and innovation had merged into something new. In letters home, sailors wrote to their families about the night that lasted forever, about the thunder that never stopped, and about the calm voice of the admiral who never wavered. Those words paint a picture no after-action report ever could, the human side of technological triumph. Admiral Lee himself would later reflect privately that radar didn't win the battle, men did. But even he knew that without the machine's cold precision, those men might never have survived to fire a second salvo. And perhaps that's the greatest irony of all, that technology, often blamed for making war impersonal, had in that moment become a lifeline. It gave men a way to fight smarter, to see farther, to survive longer. 80 years later, the lessons remain. Every modern naval system, from Aegis cruisers to missile destroyers, can trace its lineage back to that night off Guadalcanal. The same principles Lee proved under fire: detection, precision, and control. Aggression are still the foundation of maritime combat today. In an age of satellites and cyber warfare, when ships exchange missiles hundreds of miles apart, the echoes of Washington still resound. The same philosophy applies. It's not the biggest ship or the most guns that win. It's the crew that sees first, acts first, and trusts their technology to carry them through the dark. And maybe that's why the story of Washington still matters. It's not just about ships or shells or steel. It's about innovation born from necessity, about men who refused to accept the limitations of what was known, about the courage to trust a flickering green radar screen in the middle of a black ocean. Because in that moment, when Washington's guns roared and Hiroshima vanished into the sea, the modern age of naval warfare truly began. The Pacific that night wasn't just a battlefield, it was a laboratory. And from it, a new kind of warfare was born, one defined not by who shouted the loudest, but by who listened best to the quiet hum of their instruments. The wreckage of Hiroshima sank slowly beneath the black Pacific waves, her great guns still pointed uselessly toward the stars. The sea closed over her like a curtain, and with her went the last illusion that Japan ruled the night. Washington steamed on through the smoke, her radar antennas still sweeping, her crew silent, exhausted, but alive. No cheers, no victory songs, just the hum of machinery and the steady voice of Admiral Lee, calm and precise, making sure every man, every system was accounted for. For those aboard, it wasn't glory they felt that night. It was disbelief. They had faced an entire Japanese task force alone and survived. More than that, they had won. When dawn came and the sun broke through the haze over the Solomons, the sea was empty. No enemy remained, only the echo of gunfire and the knowledge that history had changed in the dark. That morning, Admiral Lee walked the deck. He spoke quietly with his officers, shook the hands of exhausted sailors, and then looked out over the ocean that had nearly swallowed them. His thoughts, by all accounts, were not of victory, but of what came next. He knew the battle they had fought wasn't just another chapter in the war. It was a blueprint for the future. And he was right. From that night forward, warfare at sea would never be the same. Radar had proven its worth beyond all doubt. No longer was night the ally of the ambusher. It had become the realm of the hunter. Washington's triumph had redrawn the map of possibility. In the years to come, her influence spread quietly. Crews trained in radar tactics. Shipyards built new vessels designed from the keel up to integrate sensors, fire control, and weapons as one system. Admirals began to realize what Lee had already known, that the power of a fleet lay not just in its numbers, but in its eyes. But as the carrier aged on, the battleships faded into the background. The Navy that had once doubted Lee's theories now turned its attention skyward, to planes, to speed, to the future. The Washington would serve faithfully in that new world, defending carriers, bombarding islands, protecting convoys, but never again would she fight an enemy battleship in open combat. When the war ended, she returned home. Her guns went silent, her crew disbanded, and slowly, like so many veterans, she was forgotten. No marble monument marks her name. No museum preserves her decks. She was cut apart for scrap, melted down into the anonymous steel of a peacetime world. But her story still lives, in the radar that guards every destroyer, in the command systems that track threats across the horizon, in every naval officer who studies how to fight unseen enemies. The spirit of Washington and the vision of Willis Lee are still out there, sailing in every modern warship that goes to sea. They remind us that real innovation doesn't come from committees or doctrines. It comes from the people who dare to think differently, who look at new technology and say, "We can make this work." And they remind us that victory is never inevitable. It's earned through preparation, courage, and the willingness to trust what others don't yet understand. So the next time you see a warship glide across the ocean, bristling with sensors and radar domes, remember where it began. Remember that night off Guadalcanal, when a single ship stood against an entire fleet and won. Remember the men who fought not just the enemy but the darkness itself, and turned that darkness into their greatest weapon, because that's what Washington really proved, that courage and innovation, when combined, can make the impossible possible. And though she's gone now, her legacy is not. It lives in every sailor who trusts his instruments, every commander who looks past convention, every ship that fights not with fear, but with foresight. This is more than history. It's a reminder. A reminder that heroes don't always get parades. Sometimes they get silence, and the gratitude of generations who never knew their names. If you found this story as powerful as we did, take a moment to honor them. Like this video so more people can discover the forgotten heroes of World War II. Subscribe for more true stories of courage, technology, and leadership, the ones history books left behind. And in the comments below, tell us, had you ever heard of USS Washington before today? Are you watching from the United States, from the Pacific, or perhaps from somewhere her guns once thundered? Your stories, your connections, and your remembrance keep this history alive. Because these men and their ship deserve to be remembered, not for the glory, not for the medals, but for the truth they proved, that even in the darkest night, courage guided by innovation can light the way to victory.